In this lesson, we'll talk about how CSS works with height and width of HTML elements. So far, we learned how to adjust the height and the width of images. There are times where we want to adjust the height and the width of certain HTML elements outside of just images. Let's say we want to adjust the height and the width of a paragraph on a web page. Well, CSS makes adjusting height and width of HTML elements easy. It'll require a bit of understanding though, so let's dive into it. The height and width properties are used to adjust the height and width of the element content area. Let's take a look at the diagram here. Starting from the purple area, which is the margin, we could go down another layer to get to the blue, which is the border. Then a step further into the layers is the green, which is the padding. Now, if we go into our final layer at the center, that is the element itself, which can be the image, the paragraph text, or whatever we're working with. That element can be adjusted in terms of sizing, both height-wise and width-wise. CSS will only work on adjusting the height and the width of a particular element area. It will not affect the padding, the border, or the margin. To work with height and width code, we simply write height and width in our CSS code on the particular element we want to modify. Height and width property can have the following values. Auto, which allows the browser to automatically and reflexively calculate the height and width of an element depending on the size of the browser window. Length, which you can tell the browser to define a fixed size of your height or width in pixels or points. Percentages, which takes the percentage of the size of the containing element. Initial, which takes the default size of the element. And inherit, which specifies that the margin should be inherited from a parent element. Also note that the size of the height and width cannot be negative. It just doesn't make sense to have a negative height or width. Here is an initial example of no styling whatsoever of HTML elements, which contains an H2 and a paragraph inside a div container. Let's try applying some CSS to it. Here we applied some CSS to our div container. We can see that our div container has been resized to 300 pixels for height and 300 pixels for width. We set the background color to powder blue, so you can actually see the div container has been set to 300 pixels. The H2 and paragraph contained inside the div container has not been affected. Let's try stretching the div container out horizontally. So here we change the width to 600 pixels and decrease the height down to 200 pixels. Changing the color to coral, we can see that the div container is stretched out wider. Now let's look at percentages. Here we're changing the height and width down to 50% of the containing element. The div is contained in the body in this example, so it'll take 50% of the size of the body container. Let's try stretching it out again. We took 90% of the body container for our div and reduced the height down to 20% of the body container. Remember, percentages will take the size of the container containing the element we want to resize. So for clarification, if you want a paragraph nested inside a div, and we wanted to adjust the height and the width of the paragraph using percentages, it will take the percentage of the size of whatever is containing in it, in this instance the div, to adjust the height and width of the paragraph. To further emphasize this point, this also means that if you adjust the container itself, percent will automatically adjust the element. So let's take a look at this example here. The first example has a containing block size of 500 by 764. This means that if we change the div element to half of that, the div element will adjust its height to half of 500 and the width to half of 764. The following examples are vice versa. For further learning, please head over to the assignment section on Replit. It'll give you more great practice activities and further instructions on how CSS height and width works.